Thank you so much for everyone who's joining us today. I hope to give you some useful information, bring you up to speed on the recent changes, whether you're an agent or if you're on here as a buyer who's looking to buy a property and wants to know how to best work with realtors now, or if you're a seller looking at a list. This is for everyone involved in real estate and that is affected by all these changes that have taken place in regards with the National Association of Realtors settlement and the buyer's agreement. A little bit of an overview of what we're going to be covering today, a little bit about me, a little bit about the settlement background, the details, why did it happen, what did it entail, the implications of the settlement for both realtors, buyers, and sellers, some practical steps. We'll have some frequently asked questions. And then at the end, I hope to have some time to be able to take some questions. This is a live presentation. Today is September 19th at 12:30. And we will have this on replay as well. If you want to review it again later on, share it with your friends, or if you know anybody that registered and they weren't able to attend it, you want to share it with them, we will make it available. But for today's purpose, it is live. So any questions you have, please place them in the chat, and I am going to do my best to answer them at the end of the presentation as we go through everything. So a little bit about me. If you don't know me, my name is Alina Nuñez. I am a real estate attorney. I also specialize in real estate, both residential and commercial transaction. I do estate planning and I do probate. So jokingly, I like to kind of say I'm a dirt lawyer. If it deals with a piece of dirt, whether you're buying a piece of property or a piece of dirt or being buried under it, I'm your girl. And I graduated law school from Nova Southeastern here in Broward County. I went to FIU for my undergrad in business administration and marketing. And I have been a licensed attorney for the last 23 years, and it's been so much fun. And I've been an agent, and I am an agent with Attorney's Title or Republic. And I've always my specialty has been predominantly real estate law, anything encompassing it. And hopefully we've had the pleasure of doing transactions together. So a little bit about the NAR settlement background, like what exactly, who is NAR, what happened, what has this all come, whether you're new to this industry, you're just kind of hearing about it, or if you're a veteran but you weren't really sure. So NAR is the National Association of Realtors. It's an organization, obviously in the real estate sector, that is there to kind of police and promote ethical practices amongst realtors for the consumer, for the public. Just like us attorneys, we have the Florida Bar that governs us and oversees us. The National Association of Realtors does that for their agents and their brokers. And they're there to put in policies and be able to maintain these ethical standards. And it has the work that the National Association of Realtors does has an impact on the integrity and the stability of the real estate market in the US. So why is NAR important? Well, the importance is it lies in the influence that it has on policies and regulations. It, like I said, it's kind of like a watchdog in which it creates policies necessary to protect the public, to make sure that, agents are acting ethically, are abiding by the rules, maintain the professional standards within the real estate profession with realtors and brokers. They're also a support and a resource for the members. So it's not just protecting the consumer and the public, but the agents themselves as well. It's there to support them and be a resource as to what you should or should not be doing. But yes, consumer protection is a big thing with the National Association of Realtors, which is what led to the litigation and that involved the NAR litigation with the MLS and other type of agencies. So a little bit into the litigation background. I'm not going to bore you to death. I'm not going to lawyer you to death here and go through too much of the legalese of it. But I do want you to have an idea of what was the litigation about, why did it happen, what were the results of it, and how does that affect all of us moving forward. So the reason for the lawsuit was predominantly due to the MLS practices, where in the MLS it was required to disclose what the commission was that was being paid by the seller to both the seller's agent and the buyer's agent. So it required to post the buyer agency commission on the listing. But now one of the issues is, well, the buyer's agent had no control over negotiating that kind of commission. It was just being told, this is what it is, and this is what we're telling you that we're going to be paying. So they felt that commission negotiations were affected, that realtors couldn't negotiate the buyer agent's commission from the listing agents. It was just like, this is what we're giving you, take it or leave it. And it kind of limited that type of negotiation. So they felt that that was a disadvantage to buyers going into the market. So some of the key issues was that it created a non-competitive market where buyers had limited control over agent compensation, and sellers, maybe they would have paid a little bit of a higher commission if they felt that they had an ability to negotiate, which, by the way, commissions were always negotiable. But anyway, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But that's just what the litigation was based upon. It was kind of felt that it was controlling or monopolizing as far as the commissions that were being paid to the buyer's agent, and it wasn't kind of giving them any sort of leverage in them being able to negotiate that. So in summary, the settlement, they reached a proposed settlement of $418 million, and the conditions of this settlement was that they cannot disclose commissions on the MLS anymore. So they had to change the MLS practices when it came to how you disclose the type of commissions that's being paid and the compensation that's being given. So their stance is that it continues to deny any sort of wrongdoing in the way that commissions were disclosed on the MLS, but that is the settlement that they reached in order to kind of find a happy median. So a little bit more about the settlement. So NAR, or the National Association of Realtors, I keep referring to it as NAR, so just so you know, they're going to pay $415.8 million to resolve the litigation. Kind of like that's what a settlement is I'm going to give you this money, we're going to settle this dispute, and in exchange, we're going to agree to certain terms. And what they agreed to was the release of liability for over 1 million NAR members and other parties involved for these practices of having disclosed the commissions on the MLS. The changes to that is going to be that they prohibit the listing buyer agents compensation on the MLS. So you can no longer list compensations on the MLS. I'm sure you've heard this because this has been talked about for a while now leading up to it. That is one of the major key changes, as well as some other agent changes dealing with buyer agent agreements. Sorry. So the mechanism for the release is any transaction available to brokerage with 2022 residential transaction volumes exceeding 2 billion and MLS not fully owned by the Realtor Association. So those people are exempt from that. And it went into effect August 17th, 2024. So we're just a little bit a month into this settlement going into effect. And I have already, as a title agent, starting to see a little bit of changes in the way things are done in transactions. So that's why I felt I had done a similar presentation on the NAR settlement, probably I'd say 2 months ago in July, leading up to this August 17th date. I felt it was important to do one again now that we have been already in the changed world here, that after the implementation of these changes, to kind of see how everybody is doing, give you my key takeaways, things that I'm seeing of what's changing, what's happening out there, and hopefully to help guide you through some of these changes, which I think some will be impactful. I think others won't necessarily will have a major impact. But so the goals of the settlement. What are we trying to accomplish here? And the primary goal of the settlement is to protect its members. Again, that's what NAR is looking out for, and it's to resolve the claims against NAR, its members, and associated entities, and to preserve consumer choice, to maintain the option for a cooperative compensation outside the MLS. Let's take compensation off the MLS, negotiate it, talk about it, and not kind of be told this is what you're going to receive. So some other of the key settlement features is it covers nearly all NAR members, realtor associations, MLS, and the brokerages I mentioned with 2 billion or below. And compensation practices allows cooperative compensation as long as it is not posted on the MLS. So that's what we're going to talk about, like how are brokers now kind of getting creative with the way that they are advertising their compensations. Where can they advertise it? How can they advertise it? So it's like you're want to kind of stay on that fine line. You don't want to violate the terms of this because you can be fined, but you also want to be able to kind of find creative ways to still be able to list your property and market your property as best as possible for your sellers, and entice those buyers and those buyers agents to come and look at your property. And the compensation is going to be offered for any broker who brings you a buyer, a qualified buyer. So what are some of the implications of the settlement? So the implications for realtors: no MLS compensation posting. We've talked about that. We know it. That should already be ingrained in your head. You cannot post compensations on the MLS. So buyer broker compensation can no longer be displayed on the MLS. Secondly, you have a mandatory buyer representation agreement. This is the other big change that came along with the NAR settlement. So now buyers must sign an agreement detailing the broker's compensation, what they're going to pay their agent. And this is very important. Before any buyer agent starts working with a buyer, you must have this agreement signed with them before you can even show them a house. This is not signed at the time that they make an offer on the house, that you say, okay, well, let's go look at houses and show them properties. And then once they put an offer on a house, then you negotiate the compensation that they're going to pay you. No, this has to be established from the moment that you basically kind of take on this buyer as your client and they hire you. You need to have clear set out terms of this agreement of what they're willing to buy you. So sometimes it gets a little difficult there because you're like, well, what if we have a seller that's willing to contribute 3% to my commission? Then the buyer saved. They don't have to pay you anything. The seller's agreeing to pay for it. But what if your buyer falls in love with a property that says the sellers say they're only contributing 1% commission to you? You better have that buyer's agreement stating that you're going to be compensated by the buyer for a certain percentage or a certain fee. If you don't have it, you're going to be stuck with just that 1%. And you won't know this because you don't know what house your buyer is going to fall in love with. And you don't know what the compensation is going to be on the side of the seller they're going to offer. So we'll discuss that a little bit as well. Settlement scope: the settlement resolves claims involving NAR and its members, Realtor Association, and brokerages with specific transaction volumes. We talked about the under $2 billion. And written agreements required. Agents must secure written agreements with clients who represent them as the buyer. That's that buyer agreement. So what impacts is this going to have on buyers and sellers? So on the buyers, we already talked. You're going to be required to sign that buyer's agreement. So now you have to sign an agreement detailing your agent's compensation. And before, for predominantly, the commissions were paid by the sellers. So buyers, if you had a buyer that maybe had limited funds coming into the transaction, your commission was not a factor that they had to take into consideration as far as their closing costs, because it was always paid by the seller. But now if the seller's not going to be contributing what you expect to be paid, or what your value as a realtor that you're bringing to the transaction, if it's not being paid 100% by the seller, then you're going to have this agreement. So now this buyer is going to have to factor in whether they're going to have to pay 1%, 2%, or a flat fee to compensate you for the value that you're bringing to them as their agent, and that you're going to be providing in this transaction. So that will be an additional cost. Additional cost, buyers will face added costs for agent compensation in addition to the down payment and the closing fees. So it could potentially put some buyers that are on a limited budget with limited funds a little bit tighter on what they have available and their purchasing power based on their financials. So also the impact on the buyers, the contracts detailing compensations. You're going to have to provide the contracts outlining how and when they will be paid. You have to have specific terms. You can't just kind of leave it as vague terms. It has to specify either the flat fee that you're going to be paying your agent, or a certain percentage that you're going to be paying the agent. And again, all of this is done once you start working with that agent. So if it's based on a percentage, obviously that percentage is also based on the purchase price of the property. And depending on what you're buying, that can range a little bit. What impacts is this going to have on the sellers? Well, it's a potential for increased profit. As I mentioned earlier, commissions were always negotiable. They've always been negotiable. It's just kind of been a norm or a standard that we've just had. The sellers always pay a 6% or a 5%, and then it usually gets split evenly between buyers and sellers agent, or whatever it was that stated in the MLS. That's what it was. You didn't negotiate the commissions, but in reality, they were always negotiable. Well, now the seller has a little bit more power to negotiate. So they might be able to retain a little bit more profits, as they no longer need to pay for the buyer's agent's commission. So before, where you had a seller who says, I'm willing to pay 6% commission, 3% to each agent, now they can say, you know what? I'll pay 3% to my agent, because my agent is out there showing my property, doing open houses, investing money in marketing, and getting marketing my property, finding me a buyer. But if the buyer brings in their own agent, I'm only paying 1% to them. Let the buyer contribute the other 2% if that's what the agent is expecting. So that is something that is giving the sellers a little bit more purchasing power in as far as retaining a little bit more of their profits, but it also could kind of, possibly at the same time affect how many buyers come and see that property and make their offers, depending on whether or not they have to contribute to their agent's commission. Possible delays in property sales. Properties may take longer to sell because fewer buyers agents may show the properties without clear compensation terms. So that's something that possibly could be affected. Where before, I know, from speaking with agents that I've worked with in the past, they could see already on the MLS, so they knew, oh, okay, this property, they're willing to pay 3%. Great, wonderful. Whereby, if they saw that a property seller was not willing to pay, they were willing to pay, 2% or 1.5%. The buyer's agent's like, I don't know if I want to, force, show this property to my buyer, because they're not going to pay me what I want, which is kind of ties into why they're removing that off of the MLS. But still, you can have certain, buyer's agents are a little hesitant to show properties that they don't know how much they're going to get paid, because now they need to be proactive in negotiating with their buyer. So it's going to really flip the script and put a lot of the negotiation and the buyer's agents showing what they bring to the table for that commission that they're going to be paid for, where before it was kind of just a given, so to say. And consultation with listing agents. Sellers should work closely with their listing agent to ensure compliance with the new regulation. So they got to make sure that they have their listing agreements in place, that what they're going to pay for compensation is clearly outlined in their listing agreements, cannot be listed on the MLS, and make sure that they know exactly clearly what they're going to be paying to their agent and what they're agreeing to contribute towards the buyer's agent's commission. So let's go into some practical steps and advice. I know we've covered everything about the NAR settlement. Like I said, this has been ongoing and definitely talked about a lot in the real estate industry over the last several months, as it led up to that August 17th implementation date. So now we're in it already. Let's ask, so what do we need to know? How can we navigate this new normal? So what should buyers know? So buyers, again, know the buyer representation agreement that you're signing, outlining your agent's compensation. Here's where I am going to, advocate for myself as a real estate attorney. It is extremely important before you sign that agreement, because you are signing a contract and entering into an agreement with that agent for the monies that you're going to pay them as far as commission. Make sure you have an attorney that's going to be involved in your real estate transaction review that agreement, so you don't have any surprises. So you don't say, oh, but they told me I only had to pay them a $500 fee, that the seller was going to take care of paying the rest of the commission. And then all of a sudden, when you make an offer and the seller's only offering a 1% to the buyer, then you have an agreement where the buyer's agent's like, well, you agreed to pay me the other 2% or up to 2% or whatnot. So you need to make sure, buyers need to make sure they understand and know what they are signing in those buyers agreements. I have already had 2 buyers reach out to me since this went into effect a month ago, where they were starting to work with a realtor and they wanted me to review their agreement, make sure that they understood and knew exactly what they were going to be signing. Because remember, as a buyer, this is now an added cost to you for your closing costs, and you do not want to find yourself under contract to purchase a property, giving an escrow deposit, and then all of a sudden when it comes down to the final numbers, you're short on your cash to close because you didn't take into account that you were going to have to contribute 1% towards your realtor's commission. And then now you have at risk of losing your escrow deposit plus any monies that you paid for your inspections, appraisals, and so forth. So buyers, very important. You make sure you understand that agreement that you're signing with the realtors and the compensation and what is expected of you to compensate them for. Also, select an agent and discuss their compensation terms up front. What are they going to be providing? This is where agents now need to prove to you what added value are they bringing. If you're going to contribute commission to the agents, what added value are they going to be bringing to the table as far as representing you in this transaction? So realtors, now is your time to shine. Now is your turn to basically prove out there the value that you bring to a buyer and even a seller in working with them in these types of transactions. And budgeting for the additional costs. As I mentioned, you have to now include any compensation you're paying your agent in your home buying budget. This is going to be one of the biggest impacts to the buyers in all of this changes, that it could possibly shift some of this burden of the cost to the buyer. So now if you have a buyer that you're working with that has limited funds, that's been saving and saving, because as we know, the market here in Miami is a little out of control, people, and prices are high, interest rates are coming down some, but they're still, and if they have a limited amount of budget, they need to be able to factor in that 1% or that $1,000 fee or whatever it is that you're going to negotiate with your buyer, that they're going to compensate you at the time of closing. What do the sellers need to know? So you need to reassess how market and price in your property with the new compensation structure. So you got to adjust your selling strategy. Again, if you don't want to compensate the buyer's broker and you're only going to compensate partial, then you need to know that that could affect also the potential amount of buyers that you're going to be receiving at the property. But it also could put more money in your pocket and shift some of that burden to the buyer. Managing expectations on agent commissions. Be aware that the changes in the compensation might affect how agents handle your listing, how much you pay your agent, how much you pay the buyer's agent. And you need to consult with listing agents for compliance. Make sure that they're up to date on the new rules, that they know what's going on, and that they understand the NAR settlement, how could it impact your sale, and you don't want them violating any of the terms and erroneously listing anything on the MLS that they shouldn't be. Okay. So what do realtors need to know? So you need to adapt to these new rules. This is our new normal, people. You need to adjust your practices to comply with the new settlement terms, including the banning the listing of the MLS compensation on the compensation listing, not listing compensation on the MLS. Thank you. Got that out. So you need to make sure you adhere to that. You need to communicate compensation clearly. So any compensation structure, how it's being advertised, and we're going to touch upon that, like what are some ways you can advertise. So we've heard up to this point how you cannot advertise it on the MLS. There are other ways in which you can advertise the compensation structure that's being given to the buyer's agent, but make sure that you understand that, and that you also how, if you're working with buyers, how the buyer agreements work, and that you have it in place. So ensure that you are in compliance. So update your documentation and your processes to align with the new regulations, including the agreements and disclosure. So if you're a broker, make sure your agents are following this. Make sure you have already your drafted buyer agreements in place, and that your agents are using them when working with a buyer. So how can a buyer's agent get paid by a seller? So a seller can pay the buyer's agent directly at closing based upon a written request to get paid that is typically written in the contract. So this is something now that we're seeing where, okay, if the seller is willing to pay and compensate a certain amount of money to the buyer's agent, I am now seeing it where it's being incorporated and written into the contracts. So I received a contract the other day, so it can be written one of two ways, where it's either a seller concession to the buyer, so it's like a seller credit to the buyer for the amount that the buyer has agreed to pay their agent per their agreement. So this is how in one of my recent transactions, how it was worded, where seller was going to credit buyer 2% of the purchase price at closing for the buyer's agent commission. So what does that look like on the closing statement at the time of closing? We have the seller paying for the seller's agent's commission, whatever that amount was, 3%. And then we have a seller contribution. They're not paying anything to the buyer's agent, but they're giving a seller contribution to the buyer for 2% of the purchase price. And then on the buyer side of the closing statement, they're receiving that credit from the seller, and then the buyer is paying their agent that same 2%. So it kind of skips a step. So instead of the seller paying the buyer's agent directly, they're kind of giving the buyer a credit, a contribution, and then the buyer is taking care of paying the agent. So that is one way that is being structured. The other way, which is more direct, is they're agreeing to pay the buyer's agent a flat amount or a percentage amount, where it just says seller agrees to pay 2% of the purchase price at closing to buyer's agent, but it has to be spelled out and the compensation on there. So those are two ways we've seen it. Way number one was one of my recent contracts that I received, where the seller, it was negotiated. The buyer had agreed to pay 2% to their buyer's agent under their buyer agreement. And when they settled on, this was before they found this house. Once they found this house, they kind of negotiate with the seller, say, hey, I really like your house. I want to buy your house, offering top price. Can you help contribute to this commission that I agreed to pay my agent, but if you could help contribute towards it, I'll, we can reach an agreement on the purchase of the property. And that's the way that it was structured. So those are now kind of some different ways that it's being handled on the contracts. So what seller and buyer should take into consideration when negotiating commissions? Sellers, a net profit calculation. Talk to your listing agents. Have them give you a breakdown of what you're going to be netting from this transaction. And you can even ask it for different scenarios. Like, okay, well, if I'm only going to pay your commission at 3%, what does that look like? Okay, what if I'm willing to contribute 1% or 2% to the buyer's agent? What would that look like? And that way you know what wiggle room you have to play with when negotiating commissions as far as the buyer's agent. Because you know what you're already committed to paying your agent. You signed it in the listing agreement, but the buyer's agent side is still up for negotiation. So that way it gives you a better idea of what you have to play with there. Also, if you are contributing to the buyer's agent, it does make your listing more attractive, because again, that's less money out of the buyer's pocket, and it does make your listing more attractive. And agent value, what value are these agents bringing to the table to be able to compensate them for the commission that you negotiate? That should have always been there, even from before, but even more so now. So buyers, same thing on your end. What should take into consideration? What is the closing fee? What is it that you're going to have to be paying your agent to work with them? That's going to come out of your pocket, and you're going to have to factor it as part of your closing costs. And the same thing with the value. What value are they bringing where you're saying, I'm going to agree to pay you 2% in addition to everything else that you're having to pay for the purchase of the property to compensate your agent? What value are they going to be bringing? Okay. So what should realtors take into consideration when negotiating commissions? So realtors, you got to show your worth. This is your time to shine and really distinguish yourself from other agents in the industry and the field, and really kind of not only get that listing, but also get that get that buyer to work with you. So these are all things that go into showcasing the hard work that realtors put into these transactions. The amount of time spent on showing properties. So for buyers, you're not just showing one property, you're showing multiple properties. Sometimes you're working with a buyer, 2 months and you find a property. Sometimes you're working with them 6 months and showing multiple properties. So all of that goes into the amount of time you're showing properties, doing the research, negotiating the offers and the contracts that you're drafting up on the different properties that might be making offers. All of this is your time that you're putting into this one dedicated buyer. Being present at key moments of the contract, being there, showing up and being present at the time of the appraisal, showing up and being present at the time of the inspections, and showing up and being present at the time of the closing. You would be surprised the amount of realtors that I never meet because they don't come to closing. And unfortunately, the amount of realtors that are never there at the time of the inspections or the appraisal, and the buyer kind of feels left alone. This is a very stressful situation for any buyer. They need that person there guiding them. That's what they're relying on their agent. I had one agent in a property up Central Florida that we're working on right now that really kind of blew me away with taking the extra step, where the seller agreed. One of the points that they negotiated in the contract is that the roof was in terrible condition, so the seller agreed to replace the roof. The buyer, unfortunately, is not in Florida. They're relocating to this property, so they couldn't be there when they started working on the roof and to kind of even, see what's going on. So the realtor went to the property and he took a drone and he took videos, aerial videos of all the work that was being done on the roof to show his buyer. And he took multiple videos, multiple pictures showing the work being done, how the shingles were looking, the color of the shingles that they picked out by the computer, because again, they weren't here locally, so they emailed them kind of color swatches and said, pick what color you want. And he took live drone video and emailed it to the buyer, and he copied us in it as a title company. And I was so impressed, like these extra steps and really showing the value of, hey, you're agreeing to pay me a commission. And in this situation, the buyer is contributing towards this agent's commission. He's showing that value that he's bringing to that buyer. And I guarantee he will get referrals from that buyer in the future for really going out of his way and helping them, especially since they're not locally. And that's already a stressful situation. And so the other thing to take into consideration for realtors, marketing, showcasing the property. How are you showcasing? How are you marketing out there? This all goes into how are you selling not only yourself, but your client's property and showing that value. So these are all things to keep into consideration when presenting everything that you bring to the table for these buyers and these sellers. So here the other morning, I saw this wonderful, I posted it on our social media. If you don't follow us, please do. It's at Nunez Law, Florida. And I thought this was so funny and so creative. This was a legit sign on my way to the office, where clearly now we're seeing how they're getting creative with the ways that they're announcing their commissions. So on top of the for sale sign, it said 2% offered. So remember we talked about, you can't show it on the MLS, but pretty much you can advertise it in other ways. A lot of realtors have their own personal websites where they list all of their active listings that they have as a way for marketing. You can list on there the contribution that you're giving to buyers agents on your personal website. You can list it, or you can show it as this sign shows on your for sale signs of the properties. If an agent calls you for a showing, absolutely, they can ask you, what is it that, is there any contribution to the buyer's agent? You can tell them, yes, seller's willing to contribute 2%, 3%, or whatever the percentage of the commission. These are all ways of how you find out how much commission is being offered to the buyer's agent. And again, this is something that could be still negotiated. If they say 2% is offered, you can try to negotiate 2.5%, or if you've already, as a buyer's agent, have entered into an agreement where your client is willing to pay you, let's say 1%, if you want to make your client's offer that more competitive and that it would be considered by a seller, you can tell a seller, look, I know you're offering 2, My client's already paying me for 1, so I'll reduce it to 1.5. Only pay me 1.5. You're getting 1 from the buyer, so you're getting 2.5, but you're making your buyer's offer stronger for the seller to contribute because now that's 0.5% more in their pocket. So these are all strategies. These are all strategies that can be used in negotiating tools. But I thought this was kind of funny. I got a chuckle out of it. Had to take a picture of how they're getting creative with how they advertise their commissions. So now I have some just general frequently asked questions we've taken regarding the NAR settlement. We'll go through a couple of them. And then as we wind it up, I'll answer any questions. I see there's a couple of questions in the chat. If you have any more, put them in there. And then and we'll take it from there. So some frequently asked question is, and this one I've heard a lot. I've actually had some of my agents ask me this question, is if an agent, so you're a listing agent, and you're hosting an open house, and you have buyers come to the property to see this property during an open house, do you need to have an agreement to show the house? And the answer is no. So MLS participants or your agents who are registered through MLS who are hosting an open house will not need to have a written buyer agreement. The NAR policy states that when an agent is only working for the seller, such as an agent hosting an open house, there is no mandate to enter into a buyer agreement. Therefore, the agent will be able to host the open house and allow unrepresented buyers to tour the listing. Okay, so I get that. I've got that question before. Another question is, will the MLS be required to get a copy of these buyer written agreements? And the answer is no. The MLS is not required to receive a copy, but they can request it as a matter of their local enforcement. So if they feel that for whatever reason these agreements are not being adhered to or not being done correctly, they can request it, as well as the National Association of Realtors. They are not required to have it. You don't need to give them a copy every time you enter into one, but they can request it. Now, as a title agent, I will be requesting copies of the buyer's agreements so I can make sure that I know exactly how the buyer's agent is being compensated if any of the compensation needs to be paid by the buyer. Because we need to make sure, as a title agent, it's my responsibility to make sure that all the funds are collected correctly and disclosed correctly on the HUD or the closing disclosure. And in order to do that, I will need to see copies of any buyer agreements that talks about how compensation is to be paid to the buyer's agent. So please know that, realtors, cooperate with your title companies. Please give us copies of these buyer agreements because we want to make sure that we have the correct percentage amount on there and we have the correct party of who's paying what to the different realtors. Now that things are shifting a little bit, it's not solely the seller paying for the commissions. Okay. And then we have number 3. In the buyer agreement, can buyers and buyers brokers agree to a range of compensation? And the answer to that is no. So you can't say, well, we're going to enter into this agreement, because remember, you don't know what the seller's going to pay you when you enter into these agreements and start working with the buyers, because this is right when you start working with them. So you can't say, well, you agree to pay me a range of 1 to 2% depending on what the seller is going to pay. You can't do that. You have to have a set amount. So under the settlement, any compensation agreed to in the written buyer agreement must be objectively ascertainable and not open-ended. So you need to be able to determine what that amount is. So for example, a written buyer agreement cannot have a commission that is buyer's broker's compensation shall be whatever amount the seller is offering to the buyer or between X and Y%. It's either a flat fee amount, which is what I've been seeing in some of my buyer agreement. I've been seeing like a $500 or $1,000 flat fee amount, or it has to be a percentage where you say, I'm going to agree to pay 1% or 2% of the purchase price, but you have to negotiate and have that amount already determined once you sign the agreement. You can't leave it open-ended. And number 4 is, can the buyer finance the real estate commission? So this is another question I'm getting, because again, now it's adding to the buyer's closing costs. It's adding to the amount of money they got to bring to closing and factoring for the purchase. And unfortunately, at this time, no. Financing commission is not allowed. And Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and FHA do not allow commissions to be added to the balance of the mortgage. So this is something that buyers are really going to have to do their math and really going to work on their numbers and know how much they have available to give as far as a down payment, to cover their closing costs, and to cover any commissions that they're going to be paying their agent as part of their closing costs. You can't just say, well, I'll roll it into the loan and I'll finance it. They will not allow that. At this moment, they will not. If in the future this were to ever change, we don't know. But right now, no. So that's another big one that buyers are asking, because of course now it could potentially put a burden on them financially to have to come up with these additional funds. So that is the presentation and the most common questions that I had. I'm going to go through the chat now and address some of the questions here. So when should a buyer or seller consult with a real estate lawyer, like myself, in order to make sure they're protected in this new landscape after this lawsuit, after they sign a contract or listing agreement? Well, my answer is always before you sign anything. Once you sign any sort of agreement, whether it's a listing agreement, a buyer's agreement, even the contract itself, that is a contract. You are bound by the terms of that agreement. So buyers, definitely send it before you sign off on that agreement so we can take a look at it. You understand exactly the compensation that you're going to be paying for your agent, if any. Sellers as well. I always tell my sellers, if you want to send me a copy of the listing agreement, we take a look at it so you know what you're going to be paying your agent and if you're going to be contributing anything to the buyer's agent. And definitely before you sign any contract or offer, send it to us. We take a look at it and make sure that you understand what you're entering into. So before signing anything, what date did the mandatory agreement begin? Agreement issue begin August 17th. So we've been in this a little bit over a month. It went into effect August 17th. Now, one thing that I want to point out, if by chance you are under contract and have not closed on a transaction, that the contract for that property was executed prior to the August 17th date, then whatever was stipulated in the MLS as far as commissions being paid is still honored. So if you're an agent and you have a buyer or seller under contract and the MLS stated that seller was going to contribute 3% to buyer's agent, the seller cannot come back now and say, I'm not going to contribute anything. That is it. If that's what was advertised on the MLS at the time and you're under contract, that is what they have to adhere to and pay you. Anything moving forward, if you're not under contract, you weren't under contract by August 17th, then it all falls under the new regulations. Okay. Does this apply across the board to commercial real estate as well, or just residential? This is mostly for residential homes. It does not apply for the commercial. Does this new case take away the casual realtor who just gets their license and have a side hustle? Absolutely. Absolutely. This is really the time for buyer's agent to really show what they're worth, what they're bringing to the table, and negotiate what they're going to get paid by their client, by that buyer. Before, they would be like, oh, no, don't worry, the seller's going to pay me. You don't have to pay me nothing. And it was great working with buyers because they didn't have to pay you anything. They're like, oh, okay, find me a house. A lot of times buyers would have 3 and 4 agents working for them and, just, see whoever finds them a house first because they didn't have to pay them. That is definitely changing. Definitely changing. So, okay, yes, the recording will be available. We will be sending that out, whoever couldn't attend. Can the seller's agent also be the buyer's agent? Yes, it hasn't changed. That's always been the case that you can be a transaction broker, but you would have to have, again, that agreement as far as what compensation is going to be paid. And that's it. Thank you, guys. I really hope you've enjoyed the seminar. I hope it brought you a little bit more practical information now that we have been under these new regulations in the last month. There's definitely some changes in the shift in the market. Like I said, I've been seeing some, a little bit creative ways, seller contributions popping up on contracts to help contribute towards the buyer's real estate commission, and definitely those buyers agreements, they're going into effect. I've been seeing them with the buyers realtors, and some agents are taking a little bit of a gamble. They're charging a very minimal fee to their buyer, and hoping that the seller is going to contribute some of their towards the commission. Others are charging a small percentage of 1% to the buyer, and at least solidifying that they're going to get that type of compensation. But again, it's all about you showing your worth to your client and getting them to agree that you're well worth it and you are an amazing realtor. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. We have 10 minutes left. I'm going to give you 10 minutes of your day back, and enjoy. And always follow us on social media so you can stay tuned for any other webinars we're going to be hosting. Any questions you have, my contact information, happy to work with you. We work with many buyers, realtors, and sellers, and be able to get the transactions done and close. So have a wonderful rest of your day and enjoy, and we'll see you next time.